If you're not as interested as I am in the game of chess, then you've probably not heard of this small, very untalked about amateur chess player by the name of Magnus Carlsen. Born in a small town in Norway in 1990, he was a child prodigy and started playing chess at just the age of 5, and at just 13 years of age, Carlsen became a grandmaster. One of the youngest in history to do so, beating former world champion Anatoly Karpov in the same year. And in the year 2013, he became the best chess player in the world, becoming world chess champion, obliterating his opponent in the matches leading up to the title, and also later on boasting the highest chess rating ever achieved, even today still, of 2,882, all while only being 23 years of age. Well anyway, in today's video, we're going to be reliving a mind-blowing game in which Magnus Carlsen staged an epic comeback against all odds in a losing position.
No!
Or he could have very nearly lost the tournament and the game against a much more lower rated opponent. And there are some key bits of advice I'd like to give throughout the video, so let's get into it. It's the year 2019, which is crazy to think is 5 years ago now. Anyway, everyone's unwinding from the holiday season in the quiet country of the Netherlands, except this small town on the coast, which is gearing up for one of the most important and highly anticipated chess tournaments of the year. Our match takes place halfway through the tournament on round 5, where Magnus plays his toughest game yet and gets his first hard-fought win of the tournament against young chess prodigy Jordan van Forest, who's from the same country this very tournament's being played in, and is only 20 years old, a whole 10 years younger than Magnus, and already boasting a chess rating only 200 points behind him. Well anyway, without further ado, let's get into the game. Magnus has the black pieces, which some of you might know means Magnus Carlsen is at a disadvantage, as white always has a better position, according to the computer, as they start with the first move. The opening's about as boring as you might expect a Grandmaster game to be. Jordan opens with e4, and Magnus responds with c5, the Sicilian, one of his favourite openings to play, as it's quite tactical. And it's a great opening to play if you want to stop playing drawish games as black, and is a great opening to add to your repertoire if you're an advanced player, and means he's trying to play for a win. Jordan then responds with knight f3, just developing his knight out, and Magnus plays knight c6, not committing any pawns so far during the opening, which is something I'd recommend for you to do, as by pushing pawns too early in the opening, you can allow your opponent to attack you more easily, as it makes your pawns weaker. Jordan then converts into the open Sicilian with the move d4, and we get a series of exchange of takes, takes, and knight f6 by Magnus, just continuing his development, still staying within theory, and is something I'd recommend new players to do during the opening, just developing their pieces out, as it's generally the best move. And you may be wondering, how does Magnus Carlsen get into a losing position like I said in the title of the video? But we'll get into that later on. Jordan then develops his other knight like Magnus did, and plays knight c3. And here's a tip for any of you lower rated players that might play the Sicilian. Some of you may be thinking, why doesn't Magnus take his knight on d4? Well, the reason is that after knight takes, queen takes, and yes, the queen's in the centre in the opening, which is generally frowned upon. However, as no pieces can easily attack it, and because of this, it will become an amazing attacking piece during the early stages of the game. Well anyway, we get e5 from Magnus, kicking out the knight, and the knight moves forward to b5, trying to take space on Magnus's side of the board. Magnus pushes d6, stopping the knight from ever landing there, as the square's defended twice by both the bishop and queen. Jordan then gallops forward with his other knight, really playing aggressively, which is the way I normally like to play, instead of playing against players who play simple openings like the London system, which are so boring and there's no tactics involved, trying to attack Magnus's weak c7 square. Magnus doesn't allow this and just plays knight takes d5, and we get pawn takes by Jordan. Knight e7 by Magnus, getting out of the attack and attacking the pawn on d5. We get c4 from Jordan, taking space of pawns on the queen side, and Magnus rotates his knight to g6 on the king side, as when it was on e7, it was blocking both the bishop and queen from getting out. Anyway, after this, Jordan plays queen a4, trying to set up a discovered attack with the knight on the king, as the king is in castle jet. So Magnus plays the only move, which is bishop d7, or the only good move I should say, because if you play queen to d7, thinking you defend the pin, he plays knight c7 check anyway, and you can't take, because the queen's pinned. Anyway, we get bishop d7, and the queen slides over to b4, getting out of the pin Magnus just made, counteracting his pin that he just had the move before. We get queen b8 by Magnus, which is a computer-like move that I'm sure no one would probably play in a real game, as it seems stupid at first, but what he's trying to do is just play solidly and defend the pawn on d6. We get h4 from Jordan, trying to push the pawn on the king side now as well as trying to attack on the queen side, with the idea of h5 kicking the knight out. We get h5 from Magnus, shutting down all ideas of the pawn on h4, and we get bishop e3 from Jordan, just developing more pieces, making Magnus think he might castle queenside. Magnus then plays a6, asking what his knight's doing on b5 and where it's going to go back to, and the knight goes back to c3, underdeveloping, and Magnus plays the move I made this video about, which is the absolutely ridiculous move of f5, completely weakening his king entirely and giving his opponent a +1 advantage, which at this level basically means a guaranteed win, especially in a classical time control game, completely throwing the game against an opponent who's 2000 elo less rated than you, which is why I strongly recommend leaving the pawns on the side you want to castle on their starting squares, as the more you push your pawns, the more underdefended your king gets. Well anyway, Jordan doesn't capitalise on this mistake and instead decides to long castle, missing the entire idea, which was knight to a4, planning on going to b6, and Magnus's position would just crumble under the pressure, as his pawns are all too advanced and all his pieces are on the back rank practically. However, if you were playing this game, as for a general tip, you should always castle before you start an attack in chess, because before castling, your king's more vulnerable. Anyway, Magnus realises how dire his position is and plays bishop e7, trying to improve it and attack the pawn on h4. Jordan then plays g3, a move too late, as he should have played bishop to b6, trying to put on more pressure onto Magnus's position before he consolidates. Magnus now finally short castles, relieving some of the pressure that Jordan put upon his position, and Jordan plays bishop e2, the best move in the position, attacking the pawn on h5, that Magnus seemingly cannot defend, which links back to the point I already made, that pushing your pawns too much and overextending them leaves them vulnerable to attacks. Magnus then makes a game-ending mistake again, and plays e4, completely hanging the pawn on h5, which he couldn't defend anyway, and shows how even though Magnus Carlsen is the best chess player in the world, he still makes mistakes. Jordan again misses it and plays bishop d4, thinking that Magnus has a master plan that if he takes the pawn on h5, he'll somehow gain an initiative, which links to another tip I'd like to give, which is that chess is not just a physical game, but a psychological game as well, and that your opponent's rating can dictate the moves you want to play and how long you spend thinking about your moves, as you may think they're worse than they actually are. To combat this, there is a setting you can turn on which hides your opponent's rating. Magnus then plays bishop f6, wanting to try and trade off as many pieces as possible, as with less pieces on the board, your opponent cannot checkmate you as easily, and he also wants to trade off his dark square bishop, because Magnus's dark squared bishop is a lot more closed off and behind the pawns compared to Jordan's, which sees a lot more squares. We get takes, which is an inaccuracy for the reasons I just mentioned, as if your piece sees more squares than your opponent's, then it's more valuable, as it can attack more squares, and rook takes by Magnus. And finally, after 19 moves in the game, Magnus finally is better on the evaluation. Jordan plays queen b6, with the idea of playing c5, trying to break through on the queen side, and Magnus wastes no time after finally getting a better position, and plays knight e5, a great move, putting the knight on one of the 4 central squares, allowing it to absolutely dominate the centre of the board, as when your pieces are in the centre, they can restrict your opponent's movement, and attack their vulnerabilities, especially if it's an outpost, like the one shown here. Jordan plays king b1, which isn't the best move, but it's okay, as it just wastes time, as the king was safe on c1 anyway, and we get bishop b8 by Magnus, stalling as well, and also trying to reroute the rook by playing rook to f7 and rook to c7, trying to bring it over to the king side. Jordan then plays rook b2, looking to stack the rooks, and Magnus plays knight d7, moving backwards with his knight, attacking the queen, which doesn't seem like a bad move, but apparently it is, and instead he should have played bishop g7. Which can link back into another point, which is that generally speaking in chess, you'd want to be moving forward towards your enemy king to checkmate them, instead of backwards. As they say, 9 times out of 10 the best move isn't moving back, it's moving forward. But anyway, queen moves to d4, getting out of the attack, and Magnus plays queen c7, trying to bring the queen over to the king side and try and checkmate Jordan's king. And we get knight d1 by Jordan, and Magnus's evaluation slowly starts creeping up, and we get knight e5 by Magnus, putting his knight back in the centre, again attacking so many different squares in Jordan's position. Defended by the e4 pawn, Jordan plays knight e3, which is the game-ending mistake, which Magnus doesn't miss, plays the brilliant move of f4, trying to completely shred Jordan's position, because after rook takes, the f2 pawn is under-defended, and after rook g1, we get bishop g6 by Magnus, another brilliant move, trying to set up a discovered attack with the pawn on e4, and the king on b1, but Jordan, all the way a few moves back, moved there instead of having his king on c1. Jordan sees the incoming pin and plays king to a1, but it's too late, and Magnus just plays rook f8. Again, the computer says it's an inaccuracy, and that rook takes f2 is better, but it doesn't really matter, as Magnus's pieces are storming into his position. We get c5 by Jordan, a last-ditch effort of creating some counterplay, and Magnus finally takes the pawn on f2. Jordan then plays queen c3, creating a pin on the pawn on c5 and the black queen, which is useless anyway, as black can just take the pawn and it's defended, which is what Magnus does, and Jordan seals his fate by trading queens, which without queens on the board, there is no way for him to get a draw in this game. As without queens on the board, it's harder to set up stalemate traps or perpetual checks, so if you're down material and wanting to draw a game, please don't trade the queens off unless you have to. And as we see, after d6, king h7, d7, knight f3, Jordan resigns, as his two rooks are being forked, which is a nasty move, because if bishop takes, he takes the rook on d2, and the bishop's hanging, and he's later threatening a back rank checkmate on the king, as there's no squares for the king to move up to. The reason I wanted to show this game is it proves that no matter the position you're in, if you have determination to not give up and resign, but to continue playing, then you might be able to win. And I also wanted to show this game because it shows the brilliance of Magnus Carlsen, and how even in a losing position, against a grandmaster mind you, he shows his resilience, and his serpent-like playing style, in which he slowly and methodically transposes the position and chokes his opponent into resigning. Well anyway, if you liked the video, please like, comment and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel out, as these videos do take a lot of effort to make. And if you like my content, then check out this video here. That's all from me. Have a great rest of your day.